Okay, so now I'm going to tell you how proteins are important to living organisms. Again, just bears repeating, all of these molecules that I've been talking about are universal to all living things that uh, science has encountered. Bacteria, archaea, fungi, plants, animals, everything works in this same basic way. So now let's talk about how proteins are important to living organisms. Are they important? Well, yes. If you were to take all the water out of a cell and weigh what was left, the vast majority of what's left is going to be protein. 50% of the dry weight, dry mass. So protein can be used to do a number of things. Just like carbon is kind of like the Lego of the periodic table, protein is kind of like the Lego of biological molecules. Because you can really twist it, bend it, shape it, fold it, uh, helix it, sheet it into so many different shapes. Um, so here are just some of the functions: structural support, storage, transport, communication between cells, movement, defense. Um, so these are some of the functions that I mentioned and some examples of them. And we will talk more about, well, all of them, but spend a lot of time talking about enzymes in the next unit. Um, Transport, yeah, structure. That'll all come up. But I'm going to walk through these just to give you some examples of things that they can do. So enzymes, they can speed up chemical reactions. So they can't make impossible things possible, but they can make not entirely likely things more likely to happen. So, for example, this enzyme here, this purple blob represents sucrase. Sucrase is an enzyme that degrades sucrose. So, sucrose is a glucose molecule and a fructose molecule that have a glycosidic linkage. So, what sucrase can do is it can make it a lot easier to break that bond between the glucose and the fructose, and boop, they go their merry way. So this is important for how we digest our food, for example. We want to break down those different things that we're eating in our diet and turn it into our own biological chemicals. So enzymes can help break those molecules down and also help build new molecules. Storage protein, so ovalbumin that I just mentioned, a liquid protein until you boil it. For The purpose of ovalbumin in the egg is to serve as a source of amino acids that are going to turn the embryo, the baby chicken inside the egg, into a chicken. It takes a lot of resources to turn just a single cell from the parents into a brand new chicken, and it's not a lot of in and out as far as resources, materials getting into that egg. So that albumin can be easily broken down into amino acids that can be used to produce the new chicken. That's also good for us too. When we eat eggs, they're a good source of protein that's fairly easily digestible. Hormones can also be proteins. They can be steroids. We talked about steroid hormones like testosterone and estradiol, but there are a number of proteins that are also hormones. For example, insulin. People who are diabetic, either having juvenile diabetes or type 2 diabetes, have problems with their insulin secretion. And insulin, as it turns out, is a protein that is produced by the pancreas, which helps regulate our glucose levels and maintain our blood sugar. So if there's something wrong with your insulin, that's a significant medical issue that you need to get attended to. But normally in folks who don't have diabetes, that's the function of insulin. They can also help, proteins can help with our movement. In animals, the way that we move is that we've got muscle tissue, and the muscle tissues have muscle fibers in them. For example, here we've got actin and myosin, which are two different motor proteins. That's how you move. That's how your eyes are reading this page. This is how when you lift your finger, you're using actin and myosin motor proteins against each other to affect that movement of your muscles. Defensive protein, I talked about this briefly with antibodies produced by your body in response to viruses or bacteria. Antibodies are proteins that can recognize the shape of different molecules that shouldn't be in our body and help make them targets for destruction. And then transport proteins. We will talk more in depth about this in the next unit, but the cells have a boundary around them, which should look a little bit familiar. These eggs with legs here, those are the phospholipids. This is a phospholipid bilayer, talked about previously in this chapter. Well, these phospholipids make a good barrier, but we want some things to be able to get into the cell. Cells need to communicate with each other. So a transport protein can kind of be like the doors and windows in a cell membrane, the barrier around the cell to allow certain particles into or out of the cell. So imagine the phospholipid bilayer is like the walls of the house, which is the cell, and transport proteins are like doors and windows that let things in. And hemoglobin is another example of a transport protein. Receptor proteins. So this is, in addition to our muscles firing, another type of protein that's helping you to take in this information are receptor proteins that can accept signals from other cells. So not necessarily transporting those signals into those other cells, but they're kind of like the doorbell. So this picture here represents what's happening between our nerves, our neurons in our brains and throughout our nervous system. One cell, this nerve cell here, is releasing a signal that is going to the next cell, and this next cell isn't going to absorb those signaling molecules, but it's got these kind of like receptor proteins on the outside, which are kind of like ringing a doorbell. These signal molecules are like a finger. These receptor proteins are like the doorbell, which when they bind that signaling molecule, it tells the cell to do something. Maybe it's going to relay the signal to the next cell. Maybe it's going to tell the muscle that it's time to move. Maybe it's telling your eyes to roll because you're sick of my corny jokes. Who knows? All right, structural proteins. So there's proteins that can be used just for structure and support. So we don't have cell walls on our cells like a plant does with its cellulose cell walls, but our cells are certainly held together, and rather than using structural carbohydrates like cellulose or chitin, we use things like keratin and collagen and elastin that help to hold our cells together and anchor them to each other. So collagen, very important for, it's an animal protein. Only animals have collagen. But these proteins are secreted outside of their cells, and it helps to hold them together. So this is why your skin doesn't just leak all of your guts out, because they're very well anchored together by these structural proteins. So enzymes are kind of what proteins are most famous for, but they have so many other functions proteins do. And we're going to spend a significant amount of time in the future talking about how protein enzymes work and what a catalyst is. So we'll sort of put a pin in this slide, and we'll come back to this talking about what catalysts are. But Suffice to say, they are very important for keeping all of us alive. Okay, on to the next learning objective, functions of DNA and RNA.